Have you ever been in a room full of people, laughing, talking, surrounded by friends, and still felt completely alone, like there's an invisible wall between you and everyone else? You smile, you respond, you play your part, but inside, there's this quiet emptiness. And you don't even know how to explain it. If that feeling sounds familiar, you're not strange, you're not dramatic, and you're definitely not the only one. Loneliness isn't always about being physically alone. Sometimes it's about feeling emotionally unseen. You might not realize this, but you can have dozens of contacts in your phone, group chats buzzing all day, weekend plans lined up, and still feel like no one truly knows you. Here's what psychology says. Loneliness is less about the number of relationships you have and more about the depth and quality of those connections. It's about whether you feel understood, valued, and safe enough to be your real self. Imagine this. You're out with friends. Everyone is joking around. You're laughing too. But there's something you're not saying. Maybe you had a hard day. Maybe you've been feeling anxious. Maybe you're struggling with something deeper. And instead of sharing, you swallow it. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal, or I don't want to ruin the mood. So you stay quiet. And slowly, without even noticing, you start feeling alone, because connection doesn't happen through shared laughter alone. It happens through shared vulnerability. Studies suggest that people feel closest to others not when they're having the most fun, but when they're sharing something meaningful, when they admit fears, when they talk about doubts, when they say, I'm not okay, and someone responds, I'm here. If your friendships are built mostly on surface-level conversations, memes, gossip, plans, updates, it can create a strange kind of emotional starvation. You're socially busy, but emotionally empty. You might not realize this, but sometimes loneliness comes from wearing a mask. Maybe you're the strong one in your group, the funny one, the listener, the reliable one. And because everyone sees you that way, you feel like you have to keep being that person. You don't show when you're overwhelmed. You don't show when you're insecure. You don't show when you're tired. So people connect with the version of you that feels safe to show. But what about the parts you hide? When those parts never get seen, they start to feel invisible. And invisibility feels like loneliness. There's also something else that's harder to admit. Sometimes we feel lonely with friends because we don't feel truly accepted. Maybe your interests are different. Maybe your values don't fully align anymore. Maybe you've grown in ways they haven't. Or maybe they've grown in ways you haven't. Growth can quietly shift dynamics. You might sit there thinking, I don't belong here the way I used to. But you're scared to leave or scared to say it out loud, so you stay but you feel distant. Here's what psychology says about belonging. Humans have a deep biological need for connection. Our brains are wired for it. When we feel excluded or misunderstood, the same regions of the brain that process physical pain light up. That's how serious loneliness can feel. But loneliness isn't always caused by rejection. Sometimes it's caused by disconnection from yourself. Let me explain. If you've spent years prioritizing other people's comfort over your own, if you've learned to adapt, to fit in, if you become good at reading the room and adjusting yourself accordingly, you might not even know what you genuinely want anymore. And if you don't fully know yourself, it becomes incredibly hard for others to know you too. You might not realize this, but people can only connect with the parts of you that you're willing to show. Another reason you might feel lonely with friends is comparison. You see them laughing easily, posting highlights, talking about achievements, and quietly you start measuring yourself against them. Maybe you feel behind in life. Maybe you feel less successful, less attractive, less confident. Comparison creates distance. Instead of feeling like you're on the same team, you start feeling like you're watching from the sidelines. Studies suggest that social comparison can increase feelings of isolation and decrease self-worth, especially when we assume others are happier or more fulfilled than we are. And in the age of social media, it's easy to believe that everyone else has it figured out. But here's the truth you might not see. Many of the people around you may feel lonely too. They just might not be saying it. Loneliness can also stem from emotional walls built a long time ago. If you've been hurt before, betrayed, ignored, dismissed, you may have learned that it's safer not to open up too much. So even when you're surrounded by good people, there's a part of you that stays guarded. And that guarded part keeps you protected, but it also keeps you separate. Here's what psychology says about emotional safety. We connect deeply when we feel safe enough to be authentic. If your nervous system is always on alert, watching for judgment, rejection, or conflict, it's hard to relax into connection. You might laugh, you might talk, but you're not fully there. There's also the possibility that your friendships are in a transition phase. Friendships change over time. What bonded you in high school or university might not bond you now. Shared environments create automatic closeness, but when life paths shift, careers, relationships, responsibilities, effort, and emotional alignment matter more. Sometimes loneliness is a quiet sign that you're craving a different kind of connection. Not necessarily more friends, just deeper ones. And this is where we reach something important. Around the middle of this feeling, there's a perspective shift that can change everything. Loneliness is not always a sign that something is wrong with you or with your friends. Sometimes it's a signal that you're ready for more depth, a signal that you're craving authenticity, a signal that you're outgrowing surface-level interactions. You might not realize this, but feeling lonely can actually mean you care deeply about meaningful connection. And that's not a weakness. That's emotional awareness. Instead of asking, "Why am I so lonely?" try gently asking, "What kind of connection am I craving right now?" Is it honesty? Is it emotional support? Is it shared values? Is it feeling understood without having to over-explain? When you identify the need, loneliness becomes less of a mystery and more of a guide. There's also a subtle truth here. Sometimes we expect friends to meet emotional needs that only self-connection can fulfill. If you're disconnected from your own feelings, goals, or identity, even the most loving friendships can feel incomplete. Studies suggest that people who have a strong sense of self tend to experience less chronic loneliness, even if their social circles are small, because they don't rely entirely on others to feel whole. That doesn't mean you shouldn't want connection. T simply means connection works best when it's built between two whole people, not two halves trying to fill each other's emptiness. If you've been feeling lonely with friends, here are a few gentle things to consider. First, try opening up just a little more than you usually do. You don't have to share your deepest secrets overnight, but maybe instead of saying "I'm fine," you say, "Honestly, I've been a bit overwhelmed lately." Notice what happens. Often, vulnerability invites vulnerability. Second, pay attention to how you feel after spending time with certain people. Energized, drained, seen, ignored. Your emotions are information, not accusations. Third, consider whether your loneliness is asking you to expand your circle, not replace your friends, but widen your world. Join a group that shares your interests. Explore spaces where your current passions are understood. Sometimes the missing piece isn't better friends, it's different contexts. And please remember, feeling lonely doesn't mean you're ungrateful. You can appreciate your friends and still acknowledge that something feels missing. Both things can be true at the same time. It's also important to gently say this. If your loneliness feels heavy, constant, or tied to persistent sadness, it might help to talk to a mental health professional. Not because something is wrong with you, but because you deserve support. This video can offer insight, but it's not a replacement for real-life care. You deserve to feel seen without performing. You deserve friendships where you can show up messy, unsure, imperfect. And if you haven't found that yet, it doesn't mean you never will. Sometimes the loneliest seasons are the ones right before deeper alignment. Sometimes you have to feel the absence of depth to realize how much you value it. So the next time you're sitting with fraud, ends and that quiet loneliness creeps in. Instead of judging yourself, try observing it with curiosity. What is this feeling teaching you? What part of you wants to be heard? You might not realize this, but the fact that you feel lonely means your heart is still open. It still longs for connection, and that longing is human. Be patient with yourself. Start small. Let someone see a little more of you. And if this resonated with you, you're not alone. And maybe right now that's the part you need to hear the most. Because when you feel lonely with friends, there's often a second layer of pain that follows. You start questioning yourself. You wonder, what's wrong with me? You might even feel guilty for feeling this way. After all, you have people around you. You're not isolated. So why does your chest still feel heavy? You might not realize this, but loneliness mixed with guilt can make you withdraw even more. Instead of reaching out, you retreat. Instead of explaining, you minimize. And slowly, the distance grows, not just between you and others, but between you and your own emotional needs. Here's what psychology says about emotional loneliness. There are actually different types of loneliness. One is social loneliness, which happens when we lack a social network. The other is emotional loneliness, which happens when we lack deep emotional bonds. You can have one without the other, and emotional loneliness is often the more painful one because it feels invisible. You can't easily explain it by saying, "I don't have anyone." Because technically you do. What you're missing is the feeling of being deeply understood. Think about the last time you felt truly seen. Maybe it was during a late-night conversation where you forgot to filter yourself. Maybe it was with someone who didn't try to fix you, but simply listened. Notice how different that feels. Compare D to small talk or group banter. That difference is depth, and depth requires risk. It requires letting people see parts of you that aren't polished. But if you grew up in an environment where emotions weren't welcomed, or where vulnerability was met with criticism, you may have learned to hide your inner world. Over time, hiding becomes automatic. You don't even notice you're doing it. So when you're with friends, you're physically present, but emotionally guarded. Studies suggest that people who suppress their emotions tend to report higher levels of loneliness, even when they are socially active. Suppression protects you in the short term, but it blocks connection in the long term. There's also something else that doesn't get talked about enough. Sometimes you feel lonely because you're evolving. As you grow emotionally, your needs change. Conversations that once excited you may now feel repetitive. Humor that once connected you may now feel empty. It's not that you've become better than your friends. It's that your internal world has expanded, and expansion can feel isolating. You might not realize this, but growth often creates a temporary gap between who you were and who you're becoming. And during that in-between stage, it's common to feel alone, even around familiar faces. Another layer of this loneliness can come from unspoken expectations. Maybe you expect your friends to notice when you're struggling without you having to say anything. Maybe you hope they'll check in more. Maybe you wish they'd ask deeper questions. But if those expectations stay unspoken, they can quietly turn into disappointment. Here's what psychology says about expectations in relationships. Clarity reduces resentment. When we assume others should just know what we need, we set ourselves up for feeling unseen, not because they don't care, but because they can't read minds. It can feel scary to say, "Hey, I've been feeling a bit off lately." But that one sentence can open doors you didn't realize were closed. Of course, not every friend will respond perfectly. And that's okay. Not everyone has the same emotional capacity. Some people are great for fun, shared experiences, and lightness. Others are better for depth and support. No single person can be everything for you. You might not realize this, but expecting one friend group to fulfill all your emotional needs can create pressure that no relationship can realistically hold. Healthy connection often comes from diversity in relationships. One friend you can be silly with, another you can debate ideas with, another you can cry with. When you spread your emotional needs across different connections, loneliness softens. There's also the internal voice that sometimes fuels loneliness. The one that says, "You're too much," or "You're not interesting enough," or "If they really knew you, they wouldn't stay." If you've experienced rejection before, your brain may stay alert for signs that it could happen again. Even neutral situations can feel threatening. A delayed reply, a canceled plan, a distracted tone. Your mind fills in the gaps with worst-case stories. And when you believe those stories, you pull back emotionally to protect yourself. But pulling back creates the very distance you fear. It's a painful cycle. Here's what psychology says about attachment. Our early experiences with caregivers can shape how safe we feel in relationships later in life. If you tend to fear abandonment, you might feel lonely even when people are close, because you're constantly bracing for loss. If you tend to avoid closeness, you might feel lonely because you keep others at arm's length. Neither pattern means you're broken. It just means you adapted to survive. And adaptations can be updated. Around this point, it's important to pause and gently ask yourself something deeper. Are you lonely because no one understands you? Or are you lonely because you haven't fully allowed yourself to be understood? That question isn't meant to blame you. It's meant to empower you. Connection is co-created. You don't have to reveal everything at once. But maybe there's one friend you trust a little more. Maybe there's one conversation you can make slightly more honest. You might not realize this, but even saying, "Sometimes I feel lonely even when I'm around people," can be incredibly freeing. It breaks the illusion that you're the only one. And chances are, someone across from you might quietly say, "Me too." Loneliness thrives in silence. It softens in shared truth. If you're watching this and nodding along, feeling that quiet ache in your chest, please know this: your longing for deeper connection is not a flaw. It's a sign of emotional depth. You crave meaning. You crave authenticity. You crave being seen beyond the surface. That's something to honor, not suppress. So start small. Practice being present with yourself first. Journal your thoughts. Notice what you truly feel instead of what you think you should feel. The more clearly you understand your own inner world, the easier it becomes to share it. Then take gentle social risks. Ask deeper questions. Share a personal story. Suggest one-on-one time instead of always being in groups. Depth often happens in quieter spaces. And if some friendships naturally drift as you grow, allow that too. Not every connection is meant to last forever in the same way. Some are seasonal. Some are situational, and some evolve beautifully when nurtured with honesty. Most importantly, be kind to yourself during this process. Loneliness is not a personal failure. It's a human experience. It's your heart's way of saying, "I want more realness. I want more closeness. I want to be known." And that desire, it's brave. If this resonated with you, you're not alone. And even if it feels like you are alone right now, sitting with that quiet ache after the hangouts end, after the group chat goes silent, after everyone goes back to their own lives, what you're feeling makes sense. Sometimes the loneliness doesn't hit while you're with people. It hits when you get home, when the noise fades, when you finally have a moment to breathe. That's when the questions creep in. Why do I still feel empty? Why doesn't this feel as fulfilling as it should? Why do I feel disconnected, even though I'm included? You might not realize this, but loneliness can intensify when stimulation disappears. When you're distracted by conversation, laughter, and activity, your deeper needs stay quiet. But when you're alone again, your emotional truth gets louder. And that truth might be saying, "I want to feel known." There's a difference between being included and being understood. Inclusion means you're invited. Understanding means you're felt. And human beings don't just need access to people. We need emotional resonance. We need moments where someone says, "I get you," and we actually believe them. Here's what psychology says about emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy develops when two people consistently share thoughts, feelings, fears, and dreams in a safe environment. It requires repetition, it requires openness, and it requires mutual effort. If your friendships don't create space for that, loneliness can quietly grow. Sometimes it's not even about others. Sometimes it's about the pace of modern life. We're constantly busy, constantly scrolling, constantly responding. Conversations are shorter. Attention spans are thinner. Depth wreck. Eyes slowness. And slowness is rare. You might not realize this, but you may be craving presence more than company. Presence is when someone isn't just physically there, but mentally and emotionally available. No phone distractions. No rushing to the next topic, just attention. And if you haven't experienced much of that, of course you'd feel lonely. There's also the possibility that you struggle to receive connection, even when it's offered. Maybe someone checks in, and you say, "I'm fine." Maybe someone compliments you, and you brush it off. Maybe someone tries to go deeper, and you change the subject. Not because you don't want connection, but because it feels unfamiliar. Studies suggest that people with low self-worth sometimes feel uncomfortable when others show care. Deep down, they may believe they're not worthy of that kind of attention, so they unconsciously block it. You might not realize this, but sometimes loneliness isn't about the absence of love. It's about difficulty accepting it. If that resonates, pause for a moment. When someone tries to show up for you, can you let them? Or does something inside you tense up? Healing loneliness isn't just about finding better friends. Sometimes it's about allowing yourself to be supported. And then there's this deeper layer that many people don't talk about. Sometimes you feel lonely with friends because you feel lonely with yourself. If you're constantly distracting yourself from your own thoughts, if silence feels uncomfortable, if you don't fully trust or like who you are, being around others can temporarily numb that discomfort. But when the social energy fades, the internal disconnection returns. Here's what psychology says about self-connection. People who have a strong relationship with themselves, who know their values, understand their emotions, and treat themselves with compassion, tend to experience relationships as an addition, not a rescue. When you don't feel at home within yourself, no amount of social interaction fully fills that gap. That realization can feel heavy. But it's also empowering, because while you can't control how deeply others connect with you, you can strengthen your connection with yourself. Start noticing what you truly enjoy. Separate from your friend group. Start asking yourself what you actually believe, not just what you agree with to keep harmony. Spending intentional time alone not as punishment, but as reconnection. Loneliness sometimes becomes less painful when solitude becomes intentional instead of accidental. There's also grief in this process. Grief for the friendships you wish you had. Grief for the depth you imagined. Grief for the version of connection you hoped would feel more fulfilling. It's okay to acknowledge that grief. It doesn't mean your current friends are bad people. It doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It just means you have emotional needs that matter. And needs aren't weaknesses. They're signals. You might not realize this, but your loneliness could be guiding you toward more aligned relationships, toward people who ask different questions, toward communities built around shared passions, toward environments where vulnerability isn't awkward but welcomed. Sometimes the next layer of connection doesn't appear until you admit that the current one feels incomplete. But here's something gentle and important to remember. Building deeper connection takes time. It takes multiple conversations. It takes repeated honesty. It takes moments of awkwardness. It takes courage. You don't go from surface level to soul level overnight, and if you try to rush it, you might end up disappointed. So instead of demanding instant depth, focus on creating small openings. Share one honest thought. Ask one meaningful question. Stay present in one conversation without reaching for your phone. Say "me too" when something resonates. These tiny shifts create emotional bridges. And sometimes you'll discover that someone in your existing circle was waiting for permission to go deeper too. Other times you'll realize certain connections are meant to stay light. And that's okay. Not every relationship needs to be profound, but you deserve at least one space where you don't have to edit yourself. If your loneliness feels overwhelming or constant, especially if it's paired with ongoing sadness, numbness, or hopelessness, please consider reaching out to a mental health professional. There's no shame in needing guidance. Videos like this can offer perspective, but they can't replace real, personalized support. You deserve care beyond a screen, and you deserve relationships that feel safe. Before we close, take a slow breath. Notice that you're still here, still wanting connection, still searching for meaning. That longing is proof that your heart is open. You're not strange for feeling lonely with friends. You're human. And sometimes the most connected-looking people are the ones quietly craving depth the most. So be patient with yourself, be honest with yourself, and slowly, gently practice being more visible. The right people won't be scared away by your realness. They'll feel relieved by it. If this resonated with you, you're not alone.